Many of us, myself included, are very passionate about social and ecological justice. But as a white person, how do I move forward in this work while carrying the knowledge of the violence and harm that my ancestry has done? Hey, y'all. I'm Reese, and welcome to Making Meaning. Making Meaning is a podcast by the Cohere Collective here to help guide you along your path to make meaning in a way that makes sense for you. This week, I am joined by author and activist Hilary Giovale. Hilary is the author of Becoming a Good Relative, Calling White Settlers Towards Truth, Healing, and Repair. And this was truly such a valuable conversation to me because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in my own personal work, wanting to work on these things while understanding that my work has to start with me and has to start with changing my behavior to be a better ally and activist before I even could begin to start influencing other people. All of Hilary's information and Becoming a Good Relative will be linked in the video description down below wherever you may be listening to this podcast so that you can check out her work and learn more about all of the wonderful things that she is doing. If this is your first time here at Making Meaning or interacting with the Cohere Collective, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. All of the Cohere Collective stuff will be down in the video description too, so you can head over to our website. You can learn a little bit more about what we're doing and how Making Meaning as a podcast supports that work. Oh, the sun is coming out. So yeah, please subscribe wherever you are listening and leave us a review, rating, comment. Send this to someone that you think would enjoy it. It's a great way to start conversations with people. Okay. I believe that is all I have. So, as always, let's take a deep breath. And get started. Hilary, first and foremost, thank you so much for taking the time and energy to be here and spend some time with me and have a conversation. I am really excited to be able to chat with you and to get to discuss becoming a good relative.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk with you too, Reese. And just, I love having these conversations and I just am so grateful for the opportunity every time they come up. So
I love that. Well, and that plays right into my first question that I always like to start with, which is, what is one thing you're grateful for?
oh my gosh, I am grateful in this moment for my health. I
Mm,
woke up feeling good today. The sun is shining. My body feels good. And I am sitting in a beautiful, beautiful place. I live at the foot of a sacred mountain on Hopi, Havasupai, Dene, Apache, Pueblo, Wallapai, Paiute land. And I'm just so grateful for this place and being in a body that feels good in a beautiful place.
ugh, I love that. Well, and isn't it, it is truly such a miracle that our physical bodies get to interact with this physical world, right? In the same way that, you know, Mother Nature has the emotional, spiritual side, human beings do too. Like we are truly reflective in that way. And I'm always reminded of that in these moments when people call that to the forefront. So thank you for that reminder. Second question, just to really break open our conversation, is what is your story? That is a big question. Anything you feel called to answer or discuss right now is perfect.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. I love it. It's so open-ended. Um, You know, let's see. The story that's coming to me to share right now is that I grew up and remained in a state for most of my adult life, up until my late 30s, of being very uninformed and in denial about the history of this country as well as the history of my family. And a series of events started happening in my late 30s that completely rewired me and completely changed my worldview and my understanding of reality. And so that is the story that I've told in my book. And it's a story of learning to see things differently through the process of building relationship.
Mm.
And when I look back now and I think about, you know, the changes that have been brought about in my life in the last decade, I almost don't even recognize the person I was before.
Mm.
She is so different. She was so different, and she had blinders on, and there were so many things that she couldn't see, and there were also so many wounds that she was carrying that she didn't even know she had.
Mm.
And so my story has been one of taking those blinders off, learning to see things differently, and healing those wounds through very unexpected channels that are
Mm.
just full of grace and so much generosity. So that's my story.
No, that's amazing. And I will also call out, if you see me looking down, I'm just taking notes for our conversation. So I am fully present with you.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
of course.
but what do you think initially caused you to have, I'll use your word, blinders? Where do you think blinders like this come from? Because I think a lot of us are walking around with known and unknown blinders in a lot of different ways. Why is that?
You know, I think it is part of the founding mythology of the United States that,
Mm.
and probably other countries too. I imagine there are a lot of similarities in Canada and Australia. And, but, you know, since I've always lived in the United States and my family has been here for many generations, this is where I focus. I think that, you know, our country was born out of a process of settler colonialism. And there is something about settler colonialism that um, blinds and numbs and shuts down settlers. It tends to shut us down and keep us in the dark a little bit about the history that has led our people to this place, that has had our families living here for generations and going about our business and thinking that there's nothing unusual about that business for many generations. So it's kind of like the water that we've all been swimming in for many
Mm.
generations. It's the air that we've been breathing. And it wasn't until I started building relationships with other communities, with other people who are not white settlers, including Indigenous peoples and African American peoples and other communities of color, that I realized I had these blinders on that I couldn't see. I could not see
Mm.
them until I started building those relationships and making friends with people. And suddenly I realized that they had a whole other story than what I have, than the stories I was brought up with and acculturated into. And it was a shock to me to realize that there was this whole other narrative that I had really never heard.
Mm.
And in part, the reason I had never heard that is because I didn't try to. I didn't try to hear that. I didn't seek out those sources. I didn't educate myself about those histories. And that's part of the mythology, is that we tend not to do that.
Mm.
We tend to just accept that this is a land of freedom for all. This is a land of liberty. And many of us have never questioned that.
Yeah. Where do you think? So I think on one hand, there's absolutely this sort of we are all we all fall prey to our environment, right? And you don't know what you don't know. And I do think at a certain point, especially when you're young and depending on your family of origin and how you're raised, it would make sense that these questions have never been raised for a lot of people. But I also believe that at a certain point, we are responsible for our own ignorance. And it does become our responsibility and duty to make right on all of these things that you're bringing up, or at least attempt to, right? What was the tipping point that allowed you to see the path towards seeking out these stories?
Yeah, you raise a really good point. We are responsible. I really believe that. We are responsible for re-educating ourselves
Mm,
because most of us were never taught what happened in the founding realities with this country. That's part of the design, that we were not taught these things in school, and we are responsible to read the books, watch the films, have the conversations, because if we don't take those steps, then we're just perpetuating the cycle.
right, right.
um, and for me, my own path into this work, which is just one of many, many possible paths. There are many, many ways to open these doors. The way that it happened for me was through friendship.
Mm,
It was through friendship with a handful of women of color and Indigenous women who had the tremendous patience and generosity to help me see things. And because we were friends, and we were sitting together and having tea and um, going for walks and working together in some cases, I received this view, this little entry into their world, into their experiences, into learning what their families have been through, into hearing their perspectives. And because I loved them like
mm,
sisters, I could no longer look away. It was that relationship and that love,
mm.
that I have for them and that they have for me too,
Yeah.
that enabled me to begin seeing things differently.
Mm. I love that. I think that it can be really easy to boil down a lot of things to love, but the act of love is really hard. It asks a lot of us. And when we actually do confront what love asks us to do, that there is work there. And I think that that is a really beautiful point. And I think takes me to one of my first questions about the book, which is usually a question I ask a lot of authors because I'm just fascinated with titles in general and how people come up with titles, because of course there's the marketing aspect, but also how do you boil down this beautiful work into a phrase or a few words? Um, and I think I have a few questions about the title, but I'll start with why the word relative? And you've discussed the word relationship a few times. And of course, a relative is a type of relationship, but what does relationship mean to you? And how does the word relative play into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That word is one that I've heard repeated over and over in Indigenous families and community spaces.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't have thought to use that title, but one of my very early readers was a Black woman who got on the phone with me after she read my draft, and she said, "This book is about becoming a good relative." And I think that's the title. And
Hmm.
so I immediately was like, "Oh my gosh, you're right. That's what this book is about." And I respect you and your opinion so much that I am going to use that. And then I later on ran that title by, different readers, different people, and they all concurred. And that's a really important aspect of writing this book, is that it's always been done through a process of community and
Mm.
seeking feedback, seeking accountability, and, just asking people's opinions and asking for help, refining my thinking and what am I saying and how am I saying it and is it landing well or not? And so I'm so grateful because I can't take credit for that title, and that's how it should be. That
Ah.
that word, that phrase, becoming a good relative, or the phrase "we are all related,"
Mm.
is a cultural phrase that's part of many indigenous cultures. That is a concept that runs throughout many cultures, and it's a beautiful concept, and it's one that I really try to live into and put into action all the time. Because, if you think about it, being like the word ally gets thrown around a lot
Yep.
right now, lately. To me, becoming a relative is different than becoming an ally. Because if you're striving to be an ally, you're still a little bit, you don't have all your cards in. You're a little bit on the outside still. You're a little bit, you're not fully invested.
Yeah. Well, and
But
it creates a certain hierarchy as well within that very like name of roles, of determining roles.
right, right. It's like, yeah, exactly. There's a hierarchy and there's still a division embedded in that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And when I think about becoming a relative, what does that mean? That means making sure everybody has enough to eat and that they've got a blanket on when it's cold, and when that the elders have an arm to lean on when they need to walk to their chair, and that people are cared for like family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a more profound kind of relationship to try to lean into for me.
Mhm.
Yeah. And did that answer your question? Was there a second part?
Uh, absolutely. I honestly don't remember, but
I don't either.
this was perfect. I questions are I'm not looking for the exact answer. I'm looking for everything that you just gave me. So thank you.
Yeah.
um this
Oh,
is
but I know there's one thing I can tell you
oh,
too about the
please.
subtitle.
Yes.
Originally, the book did not have a subtitle on it. And I was very fortunate to work with another Black woman who served as my final sensitivity reader. And she's a wonderful person. She was incredibly generous to come in at the last minute on a short timeline and read the entire manuscript. And bounced ideas around with me and told me how it was landing with her. And we had many conversations about it. And finally, when she had finished her review and I had made all the changes that she had requested, she said to me, "We need a subtitle on this book because we need to be clear who it is for." And so we began bouncing ideas around. I bounced it around with some other people as well. And we came up with a subtitle, "Calling White Settlers Toward Truth, Healing, and Repair."
Hmm.
And that's important because this work is ours to do, you know? And um, when whiteness and settlers are centered, sometimes that can feel unsafe for people, that can feel not relevant for all communities all the time, but it is relevant for those of us who are white settlers. And we do have our own work to do, and that is what
Mhm.
this book is for. It's to help
Yeah.
us. Yeah.
I I really respect that a lot because I do think, I mean, even in this conversation, one of the very first things that popped into my mind, which I will call out right now, we are two white women having a conversation about this, right? And
Right.
it is centering the white settler perspective in this conversation right now. Not to say that that's not a valuable conversation to be having, but to emphasize who it is for and who is being called to this work, I think is very instrumental. And even in you discussing the patience and grace and generosity of everyone that has helped you, because it absolutely should not be the burden of oppressed groups to educate, right? And
Right.
I really appreciate the honesty that you have approached that with. Um, I think that's really important. And one thing that's coming up for me here as well within this conversation of relative is the notion of chosen family. And I have always been very passionate about the idea that all family is chosen, even blood family that we choose to continue to engage with as family. That is still an active choice on our parts. Talk to me about your opinion on chosen family. Because relative is associated with the family system. What comes up for you when I use that phrase?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love the idea that all family is chosen family. That's really true. Yeah. And, you know, I think what comes up for me is that part of my journey was a big part of it was learning that I had ancestors who came to the United States, even before it was the United States in 1739, began receiving land grants and enslaving people. And there was a period of time where I was really so disgusted and so angry with my ancestors who had done those things that I almost wanted to reject them as family, you know?
Mm,
There was a period of time where I wanted to reject my own family and instead cling to my other chosen family, which were different people, different communities, indigenous communities and communities of color. That was a phase of my journey, but also after I went through that phase, I decided to forgive my ancestors and re-choose my family. I have chosen my ancestors as well, and my living family as well, because I belong to them and I love them, and we are working together to heal this legacy.
mm,
Whether they are people who are on the other side and who are ancestors now, or whether they are here with us presently, I choose them. I choose my people as well. And I also choose all kinds of other people and communities as my family as well. Like, you know, I choose Black communities in Mississippi who are living in poverty as my chosen family, because they are living out the legacy of my ancestors who enslaved people in Mississippi. And so even though I might not be in direct relationship with them, I consider them my family and I'm responsible to them. I'm accountable to contributing to their well-being.
mm.
So it's like that. So if you look at it that way, it's like I have a lot of family.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're all over the place. Yeah.
Mm, mm. No, I think that that's very true. And truly extending this concept outward, shouldn't we be treating all as though they are family, right? And I think that that is the natural next step in this kind of continuation. Um, to follow up on this kind of exploration of the title, I think the word becoming is also so beautifully intentional to the way the book really is set up, in that it is not a finished story. It is an ongoing process that is clear is still continuing. Um, and I believe very deeply that being is becoming, in the sense that if we want to be a good relative, we have to constantly be becoming a better relative, and that work is never done. So you did share the story of how this one reader generously gifted you the title. Thoughts on the word becoming as for specific usage in this way?
Yeah, you just absolutely called it. I mean, that's it. It's a constant process. And even though the book is published now and people are reading it now, I'm still becoming a good relative. I will be becoming one for the rest of my life. That is my prayer, that I will continue
Mm.
becoming a good relative and that it will never be finished, because it's about continually showing up, continually listening and discerning and thinking and questioning and trying and making mistakes and trying again. And it's a constant, process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. 100%. What about the process called you to write a book? As opposed to, there's many ways that I think we can practice becoming a good relative. Um, why this way?
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a foreword in the book that's written by a friend of mine named Yeye Louisa Tish, and I have so much respect for her. She's an African American elder and a high priestess of the Ifa tradition of West Africa. And Yeye Tish and I had a very interesting encounter. This was in 2016. I started having these nudges that were coming to me while I was walking in the woods near my home. And I was hearing these almost like whispers about a book that I was supposed to write. And I could tell what the content of the book was about, and it was terrifying. It was a terrifying prospect to write such a book. And I had a series of events happen with my family and in my home that were very perplexing. And so I asked Yeye Tish if she would help me with some spiritual guidance. She did a Dilogun reading for me, which is part of her tradition. And before I said anything, she said, "The ancestors are whispering in my ear about a book that you've written." And of course, I hadn't written a book, but I had been hearing whispers like that too. And so I said to her, I haven't written a book yet. And she said, "The ancestors are telling me that the book is already written and you need to get out of the way." And
Mm.
we began talking about it. And I told her I had a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation about doing such a thing. I didn't feel that I had the skills or the capacity to write a book like that. And she listened to me very patiently. And then she gave me a writing prompt and a deadline. And she said, "No, you need to get started because they are telling me that it's happening, And so that is how it came about. Until that time, I never really aspired to be a writer or be an author, but I found that the material I was working with was so heavy, so difficult to process and deal with, that I had to write. I had to write as part of my healing process.
Mm.
And there have been I don't even know how many drafts, hundreds of drafts, because I've had to work through so much of my own baggage to get it to a place where it was something that other people could read.
Mm. Mm.
you know
Yeah. Yep. As a writer myself, yes.
yeah.
Absolutely. And not even in at least, please do not let me put words in your mouth, but the way I'm hearing you is not even in there's certain things I don't want to talk about that are personal, but in the how do I make this not a diary entry that is self-serving and
Right.
something that is actually for public consumption in a productive and useful way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that your first thought in this way was to go for spiritual guidance. I tend to be very similar in that way. And if I'm hearing whispers or glimmers or receiving downloads, it's like, okay, what is this? What's going on? What can I do to tap into this? What talk to me about spirit and how that has played a part in your journey.
Oh yeah, it's played such a big role. I for most of my adult life, I wasn't really sure where I was going with that. I had been brought up in evangelical churches as a child, and I had left that behind as a teenager, and I didn't really have a lot of direction. And in my late 30s, I began building relationships with some of the indigenous communities and peoples around me. And in their cultures and their ways, I started to see something that was very, very resonant with me. And this is the case, I
Mm.
think, for a lot of white settlers. And this is part of what often leads us into cultural appropriation.
Mm-hmm.
Because we see something that we're missing. It's and there's a reason that we're missing that.
Right.
It's we all, I believe that all people had those connections to the sacred, to the land, to the water, to the spirits of the land at one time. And that was purposely taken away from our ancestors in Europe over centuries. And so many of us here who are settlers now, we feel that gap in ourselves, and
Mm-hmm.
we're seeking, right? And so a lot of us tend to feel an affinity toward indigenous cultures, indigenous practices, indigenous ceremonies. And that was kind of the opening point for me, was awakening to a spiritual dimension of life that is connected to the earth,
Mm.
connected to the living, animate being of the elements around us, of the land herself, of fire, of water, and that became, those elements of spirituality became very important for me through my journey, and they really helped. Building relationships with those things really helped give me the capacity to do this work that's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have been able to do it, and I continue to do it. I tend an ancestor altar every day that includes, sacred fire, sacred water. I make offerings to the land every day. And those kind of practices for me are really what enable me to continue with this.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. No, that's extremely powerful. If you don't mind me asking, what was it when you were a teenager that first started your um, deconstruction from Protestant evangelical religion? Because I tend to find that in my experience, talking to people with similar passions and paths to you, many of us have a deconstruction story around that time. I would love to hear more about that for you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, for me, I think I didn't have the words for it at the time. But
Sure.
when I look back in hindsight, I realize I was just so not resonating with the patriarchal aspects of
Mm,
religion, of the way that even that churches are constructed, with some authority figure up in front who's higher than everyone else, who's talking at everyone else. Like, even that comes from a blueprint that is very old, and for me is very damaging too.
Mm.
It comes from this idea that, uh, a particular person can be ordained to speak as some kind of authority figure. When we all have that within us. We all have the ability to connect to the sacred, to
Yeah.
connect to spirit. And really, for me, in spiritual spaces, we should be sitting in circles. We should all be on the same level, and everyone should have the opportunity to speak and participate equally. Even just the way that physical spaces are constructed tells a lot, so
Hmm.
yeah, that's what I was reacting to, was a lot of the patriarchal history of religion, and
Yeah.
and also the way that religion has been, for centuries, has been co-opted by political structures,
Yep.
and used to wield tremendous power over people and create tremendous harm.
Hmm. 100%. And vice versa, in that religions wield political structures and political structures yield religions, right? Like it goes both ways
Mhm.
to further entrench this hierarchy that you're talking about. Um, when you first started engaging with this other dimension of spirituality, in addition to the lack of hierarchy and perhaps a more equitable way of approaching spirit, what, again, I'll use your language, felt more resonant?
I think what felt really resonant was, the fact. Well, first of all, let me back up a little bit.
Sure.
I had received, let's see, how old was I? I must have been in my early 30s. I graduated with a master's degree in sustainability. And so I had received this wonderful interdisciplinary education that was all about sustainability. And in the course of getting that degree, I really, we took these deep dives into the environmental crises that are happening. And it's deeply frightening. And now it's even more scary than it was then in
Yes.
the early 2000s. And so I was a mother of young children. I was seeing these crises, and I was just completely at a loss. Like, what are we going to do about this? How is humanity going to survive through these crises that we've created for ourselves? And will my children have clean air to breathe? And
Mm.
just deep concern over the well-being and the health of our planet. That was the state I was in when I started, considering and looking at, and sometimes being invited into, these other ways of practicing spirituality. And what I saw was that those ways were connected to the earth.
Hmm.
They saw the earth as our mother, as our sacred. It was our sacred, responsibility to take good care of her, to be good relatives to her,
Hmm.
and to love her as our mothers all deserve to be loved, to be in reciprocity with her, and to give back to her. Those are some of kind of the concepts that were introduced to me. And another important concept was that water is life.
Mm.
That the first person who taught me that was a Tewa elder named Kathy Sanchez, who works with Tewa Women United, and she gave me permission to share my understanding of what I learned from her. And that was a very profound teaching, to understand that water is not a thing that comes out of the tap. you know, Even though
Hmm.
that's how I had perceived it my whole life up until that point. Water is a sacred being. Water is
Mm.
life. Without water, everything dies.
Hmm.
So, um, it was that concern for our planet and our ability to continue as people
Mm,
and the ability of all the species on this planet to continue that led me into understanding spirituality differently.
mm, yeah, absolutely. I think that I'm fascinated by entry points into this work as well, because I think for me, feminism was a very accessible entree into being able to try and become a good relative, right? In doing the work of trying to become a good relative. And I think that these small ways in which we see our loved ones hurting, becoming hurt, especially when it comes to children in the future, when we get into that mindset, I think it becomes very clear how to enact, I mean, basic golden rule, right? Treat Mother Earth the way we would want to be treated, treat others the way we would want to be treated. So that's really, really, just thank you for sharing that. That's so fascinating. In terms of continuing to really do this work, you mentioned that you have some rituals and practices that you do every day to stay really connected. What are some other things that you do to continue the process of becoming a good relative? And do you have any recommendations for listeners that maybe have never thought about these concepts before and want to start this process, or are really passionate about becoming a good relative but are struggling with finding practices that feel really resonant and applicable?
Yeah, I there are two things that I would recommend. And on the surface, it looks a little bit like maybe they're not connected, but they are deeply connected. So the first thing is I mentioned my ancestor altar. That's an important place for me. And anyone, you know, practicing reverence and reciprocity with ancestors is a through line that runs throughout many cultures in the world. And
Hmm.
I feel that that's something that we white settlers can do very safely without being appropriative of other cultures. We can keep it very simple with, a candle, a bowl of water, maybe some herbs from our garden, maybe a plate of food that we make from scratch. Um, very simple it can be. Um, and what do you do once you have that altar set up? This is the piece that may be a little bit, counterintuitive for people, but for me, it has been really important, and that is to learn to listen differently.
Mm,
So you can, for example, keep a journal by your bed and write down all of your dreams every morning. Or some people prefer using a voice recorder. If
mm,
they record their dreams when they wake up in the morning or even in the middle of the night. Learning to listen to intuition, learning to look for signs in the natural world that corroborate what you're feeling or what your dream showed you.
mm,
um, Learning to really tap into that inner knowing um, is very, very important in this work, because if we try to approach it with a harsh or linear or analytical mind only, then we're just going to be replicating the patterns of white supremacy.
mm.
And so we have to learn how to tap into that part of ourselves that's much more connected, much older, much wiser than what our minds can
Mm,
manufacture,
mm.
you know? And
I,
that's a
I,
practice.
yes, I really want to pause on what it is that you just said. There's goosebumps all over my body. Um, if we approach this with an analytical mind, we are repeating the patterns of white supremacy. Like, that really hit me as someone trying my best to practice this myself, and recognizing that when I do receive whispers, glimmers, signs in the natural world, that analytical mind is the first thing to turn on and say, why? Why would that be a sign for you? Why would that be a message? Why are you, right? The critique and judgment. And it is also in those moments that we must practice the becoming of a good relative. I apologize. I feel as though I just totally cut you off, but I think that
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 was
is
okay.
I that was so profound for me personally, and I hope it is for listeners as well.
Yeah.
That truly, truly.
Well, I want to mention a book that was so helpful for me. It's called Witches and Pagans, and it's by an
Mm,
independent feminist historian named Max Dashu. And when I read that book, it landed so many things for me, because I realized that the pattern of delegitimizing our dreams, our intuition, our ability to be in relationship with the land and the water, our ability to weave cures and blessings and spells that take care of our families and our communities, all of that has been impeded by this very deliberate assault that went on for hundreds and hundreds of years throughout Europe.
yeah.
And when I read that book, I mean, it just landed on me like a ton of bricks. It was like, oh, there's a reason why we've all been conditioned to question it when we receive guidance, or when we receive a dream or intuition that is pointing us in a direction. There's a reason,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. What one thing that's coming up for me right now, and in what you're saying, with like especially throughout Europe, but also the United States and largely Western culture that is entrenched in settler colonialism, but also capitalism, is how much finances have come into play in religious systems, right? And I last year had the privilege of visiting Vatican City, and it is absolutely stunning, an extremely spiritual experience. The opulence is overwhelming
Mm.
in that it reminded me so starkly of the disconnect between people who are quote unquote trying to live in the footsteps of Jesus, but also have such wealth that could be disseminated and spread and used to help and uplift. And it makes so much intuitive sense to me that, of course, these inner messages, messages from ancestors, messages from Mother Nature, from the earth, from our interconnectedness, would be called into question, because then there would be no need for this hierarchy. There would be no need for this power. There would be no need to pay money to these systems and structures. Um, yeah, I don't think there's a
Yeah.
question in there,
Wow.
but
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're right. Yeah. And
wow,
that
wow, wow.
all that gold is, was stolen from these lands that were harmed by the European imperialism.
Right.
It's so sad
Well,
to
and how
me.
much of that spiritual connection that I felt entering into that space is truly the natural materials that are being used here, right? That hold the energy of that sacred land, of those sacred traditions that has been appropriated for new
Yeah.
means and purposes.
Yep.
Whew,
Yeah.
that is really powerful.
Yeah.
Um,
I think,
continuing. Oh,
can
please,
I add something to that too? Because I
please, please,
really
please.
think, as part of my journey, I've studied and read about the doctrine of discovery a little bit, which originated with the Catholic Church. And, Pope Francis has taken some steps in recent years
Mm-hmm.
to apologize, and he did denounce the doctrine of discovery. But and this is the second step I wanted to offer, so it kind of leads into that. Until there are reparations made, until land is returned, until resources are returned, we aren't there yet. We're not done.
Mm,
These
yeah.
institutions that have wrought this colonial damage all over the world need to be accountable for what they have done. And, it's easy for me to sit here and say that. I don't have any leverage with Pope Francis or the Catholic Church. But on the other hand, there are steps that we as individuals can take too, and that is to create personal reparations plans. While we're waiting for our governments and our institutions to get their acts together, we can do it. Every single person has it within their power to look at their situation, listen to their intuitive guidance, and begin a process of making personal reparations. And
Mm,
there's a guide that I have written up that I will share with you in the show notes
please.
that anyone can use. It's just, um, a series of steps and guidance that I found helpful in working with people, but it can be done any way. If you have other ways of approaching it, that's great too. And I just think it's really important for us to begin this conversation about reparations and for each of us to commit to taking steps.
Mm. I would love to read this write-up booklet that you have created, and we will absolutely include it in the show notes. So wherever you are listening or watching the podcast, head down below to look into it for yourself. What are some of the steps that personal reparations entails? Because this, in full honesty and transparency, is a new concept for me. Of course, I've heard of larger scale reparations in terms of what governments and societies can do to try and make right and do better. Um, but it does feel um, at times a little hopeless as a singular individual that my voice and my vote and my how I vote with my dollar and my eyeballs is powerful and is important, but can only do so much. So talk to me about this personal level.
Yeah. I think this is one of the hangups and the myths that gets imposed on us as white settlers, because I have
Mm-hmm.
had to navigate this myth myself, like the myth of anything that I can do will never be good enough.
Mm.
The myth of perfectionism. Like if I can't get it perfectly right, then there's no point in doing it at all. I have had to traverse that landscape in my mind many, many times and push through to the other side. I remember one time a mentor of mine sent me a postcard that said, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." And that is what we're going for with personal reparations plans. We can't fix it. We cannot fix the centuries of genocide and slavery and land dispossession and etc., all the things that have happened through colonization. We cannot fix that. But what we can do is try to reduce the harm that is
Mm.
continuing today. And that's what personal reparations plans are all about. They're about trying to reduce the harm.
Mm.
And every single one of us has access into that. So, for example, you know, I facilitate groups who work together for 8 months at a time, and we work on personal reparations plans. And some of the steps that I've seen people incorporate are things like, you know, hosting a cooking workshop with a reparations based menu, and then
Mm.
giving the proceeds from that workshop back to a Black owned farm that's in the community. or gathering in the garden of an Indigenous elder and doing work in her garden to help weed her garden and turn her compost pile, and then cooking a meal that everyone shares together at the end. Some people, instead of giving, birthday presents, Christmas presents to our white friends and family, some people are saying, I made a contribution to this BIPOC-led organization in your honor for your birthday, because the truth is we don't really need any more presents, probably. Like, what we need is to support our relatives, right? And so that can be a beautiful way to open conversations with friends and family. Because for me, the goal of personal reparations plans is kind of twofold. One is for us to get into action and taking steps like that. But the second objective is we need to be having these conversations with each other, with our own communities, our own families. We need to be, normalizing and co-creating a culture of reparations with each other.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. Well, and the accountability that I would imagine that creates as well when you start having these discussions and you're holding yourself accountable by creating these groups and being there and stating out loud that this is a priority for me, but of course the other people in your life as well. What are some ways that you have come up against difficulties in having these conversations with other people in your life, and I suppose recommendations for other people that are endeavoring to do this work as white settlers trying to make reparations and do better and reduce harm, but are really wanting to have these conversations with people who don't understand or aren't there yet?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is so difficult because it's triggering.
Yeah.
For us. We as a people, meaning, Euro descended settlers, white people, we in general have not developed the muscle of having this conversation. And part of it is because our whole way of being is to not talk about it. And so
Yeah.
we don't practice very much. And so it's hard. I mean, it triggers people. It it can feel threatening to people.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel so grateful that I've had so much help with my book, because I worked with one editor a couple of years ago when I already had what I thought was a pretty complete manuscript, but she came in and started working with me, and she said to me, these parts of the book where you're up on your high horse and lecturing people don't work. And I was
Whoa.
like, oh, you're right. They don't work. And so that was so helpful, because what she helped me understand was what does work and what is compelling is storytelling.
Mm.
And that's why in the groups I co-facilitate, we spend a lot of our time focusing on storytelling, because nobody needs to be shamed or lectured or told that they're doing something wrong. That doesn't
Right.
work. But what we do need to do is witness each other and sit together and hear each other's stories, because stories build empathy and connection, and they humanize us with each other. And so,
Mm.
I've made mistakes. I've alienated people by getting on a soapbox, and I really try not to do that anymore, and to really come from more of a place of empathy and connection and patience and compassion, you know,
Mm.
and non-judgment. I mean, we're all trying our best, and you know, as you go down this path and as you're in this work for a while, you can start to see when people are at earlier phases than you, And that's the time to reach out and hold someone's hand and offer to walk beside them and
Mm.
not shame them. Because that, again, is another product of white supremacy, that shaming, you know?
Wow. Yeah. Yes. Whew. I am so deeply enjoying this conversation, but I, of course, want to be mindful and respectful of your time. So, as we approach the end of our time together, I have a few more questions. One, in light of our conversation and everything we have discussed or not discussed, is there anything you would like to return to, reemphasize, clarify, or add in that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet?
I think I would like to just share with people that one of the aspects of my book that's very important to me is that I don't receive income from this work. Any income that comes to me from book sales, I'm returning to the Decolonizing Wealth Project and Jubilee Justice, and I can share those links as well.
Please do. I
And
will include them in the show notes.
that's important to me because this work is so sacred to me that I can't make a living off of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
It's in order to keep it clean and to keep it grounded and real, I can't profit. And so
Mm.
I want, I have chosen those two organizations for very specific reasons because of where they're located, who runs them, and the way that those origin stories of those organizations, which are both Black and Indigenous led organizations, the way that those origin stories interweave with my own family history is very important. And so that is part of my personal reparations plan, is to share my own story as an act of service and return the proceeds to them, because
Mm.
the privilege that I have, that I'm walking around with and benefiting from every day of my life, was derived from acts of theft. And so it's important for me to return what was stolen. And,
Mm.
you know, I just honor and respect the work of those two organizations so much. And I invite listeners to check them out and, consider supporting them as well, or other organizations that are in your community or that are being run by people that are doing meaningful work to decolonize and to take care of people and take care of the land. So that's probably what I would add.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Um, yes, all of those links for listeners and watchers will be in the description down below, wherever you are. And really great way to support this work is to go buy the book. The proceeds are going to go to these wonderful organizations. And the reading was extremely powerful for me in my own work in trying to become a good relative. Um, there will always be more to go and more to do, but it was truly such an honor to be able to engage with your words and in this conversation. So thank you. And if you are interested in purchasing the book, that will be all of that information will be available down in the description as well.
Thank you so much, Reese.
Absolutely. One final question that I always use to just put a little button on the end of the episode. What is one word to describe how you feel right now?
I feel grateful.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm grateful for all the abundance that surrounds us, and that this moment in history has come when we can begin unpacking these things too.
Hmm.
It wasn't always so, and we are here now. We have the capacity to begin this together. And I'm just really grateful. And I'm grateful for you too. And thank you so much for your wonderful questions and your deep listening and making this conversation possible.
Absolutely. It was my utmost pleasure to be able to read your words and have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you all so very much for making it this far and for being here today and being a part of the collective. Of course, another huge thank you to Hilary for her time, energy, and vulnerability in this episode. All of Hilary's information, as well as where you can access the book, will be linked down below wherever you are listening or watching this episode of Making Meaning. You can also find the Cohere Collective in the description down below. Our website is where you will be able to explore all that the Cohere Collective is. If you are interested, I also work one-on-one with people to help them find and pursue their purpose. If that sounds like something you are ready to endeavor, I would love to chat with you more about it. You can also follow the Cohere Collective wherever you have social media, all at the Cohere Collective, and you can follow me on Instagram at Lillian Reese Brown. A huge thank you to Nicole Ostreicher for Making Meaning's art and podcast cover. You can find her on Instagram at Nicole O Creates and Nicole O Design. And a big thank you to Tristan Morgan for Making Meaning's theme music. You can find him on Instagram at Tristan Morgan. Right now, I am feeling... How am I feeling? Restful. I'm feeling very restful. The holidays are upon us, basically, and I don't know if you can tell, but I am in my room at home, not in Italy. I have traveled back home, and it has just been a really, really lovely break from every single day being something different. Of course, it's still a lot of energy to return to this place and experience what it's like to feel changed and different in a place that has been so constant for me for so long. But that same feeling of comfort and security that comes from the stability is very much here, and that has just felt like a very nice, warm hug. There is something to coming home that will make you revert back to some of your old patterns a little bit, and so I've been working through that and taking the time to process that, but also taking the time to rest and enjoy too, that not everything has to be work, nor should everything feel like work. It is okay for breaks to be breaks. Thank you all so very much for being here today, and I hope you feel like you are living more coherently. Until next time, love.